40 days, 11 disciples, 0 pages in your Bible. Think about that for a moment. After the resurrection, the single most important event in Christian history, Jesus didn't ascend immediately. He stayed. He taught. For 40 days, he gathered his closest disciples and shared things he had never said publicly. Acts 1:3 confirms this explicitly. And your New Testament gives you almost nothing about what was said. That's not an accident. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed that Jesus spoke differently depending on who was listening to the crowd's parables? Simple stories. A farmer scattering seeds, a lost sheep, a prodigal son. Beautiful, accessible, and deliberately incomplete. But to his inner circle, something else entirely. Matthew 13:10. The disciples pull him aside after one of those public parables and ask directly, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" And Jesus answers them with a sentence that has been sitting in your Bible for 2,000 years, largely unremarked upon, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Not to them. 7 words that reframe everything you thought you knew about the most public teacher in human history. That phrase, given to you, appears in some form 7 times across the 4 Gospels. 7 deliberate acknowledgments that there was an inner circle, that there were teachings reserved for those who were ready to receive them. So here is the question that should stop you cold. If Jesus intentionally shared deeper truths with those he trusted most, what were those truths? What did he actually transmit to that inner circle during 40 days of unrecorded teaching? And who, if anyone, was paying close enough attention to write it down? That's exactly what this investigation is about. And I want to be specific with you, because vague promises are easy to make and easy to forget. So let me tell you precisely what we are going to uncover in the next hour. First, we are going to examine the evidence inside the canonical Gospels themselves that Jesus operated a deliberate 2-tiered teaching system, not a theory, not a fringe interpretation. Words that have been sitting in Matthew, Mark, and Luke for centuries, hiding in plain sight. Second, we are going to follow the trail to Ethiopia, the one Christian tradition that never passed through the filter of Roman imperial politics, and look at what their ancient manuscripts actually preserve about how Jesus transmitted knowledge to his closest disciples. Not just what he taught, but the method itself. A distinction that changes everything. Third, we are going to meet the man who more than any other single figure made sure that method was erased from Western Christianity, and understand exactly why he did it and what he needed to gain. And fourth, we are going to ask a question that nobody in this space is asking. Why does the same structural pattern Jesus used with his disciples keep reappearing independently in a Harvard neuroscience laboratory in 2011? Stay with me. This one goes deep. To understand why Ethiopia preserved what Rome destroyed, you need to understand a fact that most Western Christians have never been taught. Ethiopia did not receive Christianity through Rome. It received it directly. Acts 8:26 through 40 describes the moment with unusual specificity. Philip the evangelist encounters an Ethiopian official, a court treasurer of Queen Candace traveling home from Jerusalem, reading the prophet Isaiah in his chariot. Philip explains the text. The official asks to be baptized on the spot, and then he continues his journey home, carrying the new faith with him into the Horn of Africa. This was not the 2nd century. This was not after the councils. This was within years, possibly months, of the crucifixion itself. That single fact has enormous implications. When the Council of Nicaea convened in 325 CE under Emperor Constantine to standardize Christian doctrine, Ethiopian bishops were not meaningfully present. When the Council of Carthage in 397 CE voted to formalize the biblical canon, deciding which texts would survive and which would be set aside, Ethiopian Christianity had already been developing independently for the better part of 3 centuries. They were not rebels. They were not heretics. They simply were not there. And what was never submitted to those councils was never subject to their decisions. Dr. Getachew Haley of St. John's University, the scholar who has spent his career cataloging more than 10,000 Ethiopian manuscripts for the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, has described the Ethiopian textual tradition as representing a form of Christianity that crystallized before the major standardization events of the 4th century. His cataloging work, which began in 1973 and continued for decades, revealed the sheer scope of what Ethiopian monasteries had been quietly preserving texts in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, that had no surviving parallel anywhere else in the Christian world. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books. Protestant Bibles contain 66. Catholic Bibles contain 73. Those additional books are not footnotes. They are not appendices. Among them, the complete Book of Enoch, a text quoted directly by the Apostle Jude in the New Testament, a text that was copied at least 25 times by the Qumran community near the Dead Sea, a community that existed during Jesus' own lifetime. Dr. James Vanderkom of the University of Notre Dame, who has spent 4 decades studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirmed in his published research that Enoch was among the most frequently copied texts at Qumran, second only to Psalms and Deuteronomy. Jesus would have known it, studied it, possibly taught from it, and yet it vanished from every Western Bible, except Ethiopia's. But here is where the investigation takes a turn that most people miss entirely. The difference between the Ethiopian tradition and the Western tradition is not simply a matter of which books survived. It is a matter of what those books were understood to do. In Ethiopia, the transmission of sacred knowledge was never purely a literary exercise. Alongside the written texts existed a parallel oral tradition called Andemta, a system of multi-layered scriptural commentary passed down verbally through generations of church school teachers. Andemta does not present a single meaning for a passage. It presents 4 simultaneous levels of interpretation: the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the hidden or mystical meaning. Scholars at the Hiob Ludolf Center for Ethiopian and Eritrean Studies at the University of Hamburg have documented how this system preserves interpretive traditions that predate the written manuscripts themselves. This is not incidental. This is structural. Ethiopia preserved not just texts, it preserved an entire architecture of how sacred knowledge was meant to be received, layered, and transmitted. An architecture with a precise historical name in the Ethiopian tradition. And it maps with startling accuracy onto exactly what Jesus described when his disciples asked him why he taught the crowds in parables. And wait until you hear what the final piece of evidence reveals, because it changes the entire picture. Let me introduce you to a man you have almost certainly never heard of. His name is Eusebius of Caesarea. He lived from approximately 260 to 339 CE. He was the bishop of Caesarea Maritima, the most prolific Christian writer of his era and the personal biographer of Emperor Constantine. He is often called the father of church history, and that title is accurate. He shaped the historical record of early Christianity more than any other single individual. He is also the man most directly responsible for the architecture of what you were allowed to know. To understand what Eusebius did, you need to understand the world he was operating in. By the early 4th century, Christianity had been spreading for 300 years across an enormous geographic area, from Ethiopia to Britain, from Persia to Spain. And in that 300 years, it had fractured into dozens of competing interpretations. There were communities that emphasized direct personal experience of the divine, communities that preserved what they called secret teachings passed down from the apostles themselves, communities that used texts your Bible has never contained, communities that understood Jesus as a transmitter of interior spiritual knowledge, a teacher whose public parables were the surface layer of a deeper system of instruction available to those prepared to receive it. These communities were not small. They were not fringe. The Valentinian Christians, followers of Valentinus, who had studied in Alexandria and nearly became Bishop of Rome in the 140s, CE, represented one of the largest and most intellectually sophisticated Christian movements of the 2nd century. Valentinus taught a system of graduated knowledge, public teaching for the many, deeper transmission for the prepared. He claimed, and his followers believed, that this structure came directly from the apostles themselves. Then Constantine converted. In 312 CE, the Emperor of Rome adopted Christianity, and almost immediately, the theological diversity that had characterized 3 centuries of Christian development became a political liability. An empire cannot be governed by a religion with 40 competing interpretations. An empire needs a single doctrine, a single canon, a single chain of authority running from God to emperor to bishop to priest to layperson, with no side exits. This is the context in which Eusebius operated, and Eusebius was not naive about it. He understood exactly what Constantine needed, and he provided it with remarkable efficiency. His ecclesiastical history, completed in stages between 313 and 325 CE, did something that had never been done before. It constructed a single linear narrative of Christian origins, tracing an unbroken chain of authority from Jesus to the apostles to the bishops of the major sees. In this narrative, diversity was not development. It was deviation. Communities with alternative texts, alternative teachings, alternative structures of transmission were not preserving older traditions. They were, by definition, heretics. Eusebius did not invent this framing, but he systematized it. He gave it the weight of historical documentation, and he did it at precisely the moment when the Roman state had the power to enforce it. In 325 CE, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. Eusebius was present. The council standardized the nature of Christ in the Nicene Creed, but its implications extended far beyond theology. It established the principle that Christian doctrine was determined by council consensus, ratified by imperial authority. What fell outside that consensus was not simply alternative, it was dangerous. The targeting was specific, and the logic was not primarily theological, it was structural. Here is the key insight that most historians of this period understate. The communities whose texts and practices were most aggressively suppressed in the 4th and 5th centuries shared one common characteristic. They preserved models in which individual believers could access spiritual truth directly without institutional mediation. If Jesus transmitted a method of inner knowing to his closest disciples, a practice, rather than merely a proposition, then that method was inherently ungovernable. You cannot tax a practice. You cannot require institutional permission for an interior experience. You cannot build a hierarchy on top of a teaching that says, the kingdom of God is within you. Eusebius understood this. His ecclesiastical history barely mentions the communities that taught direct interior access to the divine. And when it does, it frames them as corruptions. The Valentinians, the followers of Marcion. The communities that produced the texts later discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945. In Eusebius's historical account, they appear as aberrations. The historical record shows something different. They were, in many cases, older. Now, here is where Ethiopia enters the picture in a way that is rarely discussed. In the same century that Eusebius was constructing his authorized narrative in Caesarea, King Ezana of the Aksumite Empire officially adopted Christianity, making Ethiopia one of the first Christian nations in recorded history, converting even before Rome's formal Christianization was complete. But Ezana did not convert under Roman pressure. He converted through the influence of Frumentius, a Syrian scholar who had been educated in Alexandria and who brought with him a tradition of Christianity that predated the Nicene settlement. Crucially, Frumentius was consecrated as the first bishop of Aksum, not by Rome, but by Athanasius of Alexandria in 328 C, 3 years after Nicaea, in a church that was already in deep tension with the Roman imperial project. Ethiopia's founding Christian figure came from a tradition that was from its very beginning operating outside the Roman framework. This is not a minor footnote. It means that the texts and the transmission methods that arrived in Ethiopia in the 4th century came through a channel that Eusebius did not control. What survived in the Ethiopian highlands was not what Eusebius approved. It was what he never got to review. And what survived in the Andemta oral tradition, in the 81-book canon, in the structural memory of how sacred knowledge was meant to move from teacher to prepared student, preserves something that the Western Church systematically dismantled. A method, not a secret in the conspiratorial sense, not hidden from the public out of calculation or malice, but reserved carefully, deliberately, for those who had done the interior work necessary to receive it. We've covered the world that suppressed it. Now, in the second half of this investigation, we turn to the evidence itself, what that method actually was, and what the Ethiopian tradition preserved about how Jesus transmitted it. Let me show you the breadcrumbs, one at a time, because this is not a single discovery. It is a trail, and the trail begins as it almost always does, hiding inside a text you thought you already knew. The first clue, what Matthew 13 actually says. Open the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. Jesus has just finished telling the parable of the sower to a large crowd gathered on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He finishes speaking, and the crowd disperses. Then the disciples approach him privately and ask a question so direct it has always surprised me that more people don't stop on it. Why do you speak to the people in parables? Not what does this parable mean? They understood the parable. The question is about the method. Why this form of communication? Why the layered story instead of the direct statement? And Jesus answers them in a way that is completely unambiguous. Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have even what they have will be taken from them. Read that again, slowly. The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. This is not metaphor. This is not humility. This is Jesus explicitly acknowledging to his inner circle that he is operating a two-tiered transmission system: public parables for the crowds, direct knowledge for those who have been prepared to receive it. The parable is not the teaching. The parable is the door, and not everyone is being invited through it. This passage has been in the canonical Gospel of Matthew for 2,000 years. It has never been hidden. And yet, the theological tradition that grew from Matthew, the Western Church, spent 17 centuries building an institution premised on the idea that Christian truth was equally accessible to all believers through the mediation of clergy and sacrament. A tradition that spent those same 17 centuries suppressing any community that claimed access to a deeper layer of teaching. The contradiction has been sitting in chapter 13 the entire time. The second clue, the Didache. In 1873, a Greek Orthodox metropolitan named Philotheos Bryennios discovered a manuscript in the library of the Jerusalem Monastery of the Holy Sepulchre in Constantinople. The manuscript had been sitting there uncatalogued since 1056 CE. When Bryennios published its contents in 1883, the scholarly world was stunned. The document was the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles. Scholars date its composition to somewhere between 50 and 120 CE, making it one of the earliest Christian documents in existence, contemporaneous with, or possibly predating, several New Testament letters. And the Didache describes with remarkable specificity a structured system of Christian initiation with two distinct levels. The first level is public. It describes basic moral teaching, the two ways, the way of life and the way of death, available to any inquirer. The second level is explicitly reserved. Baptism itself in the Didache is not a public event open to anyone who asks. It requires preparation, a period of fasting, instruction. The Didache states directly, before the baptism, let the one who baptizes and the one being baptized fast, and any others who are able. You must instruct the one being baptized to fast for 1 or 2 days beforehand. This is initiation language. This is the language of graduated access to sacred knowledge, the same structure Jesus described in Matthew 13. And it comes from a document that claims direct apostolic origin, composed within living memory of the first disciples. The Didache was never part of the Western biblical canon. It was set aside. But in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, texts from the same apostolic collection, including the apostolic constitutions, a closely related document, remained part of the ecclesiastical framework that shaped how knowledge was transmitted in Ethiopian church schools for over 15 centuries. The third clue, the Apocryphon of James. In December 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt when his mattock struck a sealed earthenware jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts and Coptic texts that had been buried in the Egyptian desert sometime in the late 4th century, almost certainly to protect them from destruction. Among those texts was the Apocryphon of James, the secret book of James. The text opens with a letter from James, the brother of Jesus, describing a revelation he received 550 days after the resurrection. James describes Jesus gathering him and Peter privately, separately from the other disciples, and transmitting teachings he had not shared with the larger group. The language Jesus uses in this text is startling in its directness. He tells James and Peter, "Become better than I. Make yourselves like the Son of the Holy Spirit." He instructs them not simply to believe, but to undergo an interior transformation that precedes the capacity to transmit what they have received. He says explicitly that they must become full before they can pour into others. This is not the language of propositional belief. This is the language of experiential transmission, of a practice that changes the practitioner before it can be shared. Dr. Ron Cameron of Wesleyan University, one of the leading scholars of the Nag Hammadi library, has argued in his published research that the Apocryphon of James preserves traditions that are genuinely early, not late Gnostic fabrications, but reflections of a real debate within first-century Christianity about who was prepared to receive what and when. The text was buried to protect it. Ethiopia never needed to bury anything, because Ethiopia never faced the institutional pressure that made burial necessary. The fourth clue, the Andemta and what it tells us about structure. Here is where the Ethiopian evidence becomes not just interesting, but structurally unique. In every Ethiopian Orthodox Church school, and these schools have operated continuously since the 5th century, sacred texts are not taught with a single meaning. They are taught through a method called Andemta, a system of layered oral commentary passed from teacher to student across generations, in which every scriptural passage carries at minimum 4 simultaneous levels of meaning. The first level is Turgum, the literal translation of the Ge'ez text into Amharic, accessible to any student beginning their studies. The second is Andemta proper, the allegorical meaning connecting the passage to broader theological themes. The third is Ye'isat Tibeb, the moral or ethical application, what the passage demands of the listener's interior life. And the fourth, the level taught only to advanced students who have demonstrated sufficient preparation, is the hidden or mystical meaning, which addresses the direct experiential encounter with the divine that the passage points toward. This 4-level structure was not invented by Ethiopian monks in the Middle Ages. Dr. Alessandro Bausi of the Hiob Ludolf Center for Ethiopian and Eritrean Studies at the University of Hamburg, the leading institutional center for Ethiopian manuscript research in Europe, has documented how the Andemta tradition preserves interpretive layers that trace back to the earliest Alexandrian Christian schools of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Schools that were operating before Eusebius, before Nicaea, before the standardization that flattened 4 levels of meaning into one. Origen of Alexandria, the most sophisticated biblical scholar of the early church, who died around 253 CE, taught an almost identical 4-level system of scriptural interpretation: the somatic, the psychic, the pneumatic, and the hidden. Origen was later condemned by the Western Church. His multi-layered interpretive system was judged too dangerous, too close to the Gnostic traditions the Church was suppressing. His works were partially destroyed. In Ethiopia, the same structural logic survived intact. Not because Ethiopian monks were rebels, but because they were never required to choose between it and institutional approval. And now the detail that almost nobody in this conversation has connected. The Ascension of Isaiah, a text preserved complete only in the Ethiopian biblical canon, describes the prophet's journey through 7 concentric levels of heaven, each requiring greater interior preparation before passage is granted. The text explicitly frames this journey not as a physical event, but as a model for interior ascent. The soul moves inward through successive layers of readiness toward direct encounter with the divine. Early Christian communities read this text as a map of exactly the kind of interior journey that Jesus was preparing his closest disciples to undertake during those 40 days of unrecorded teaching. The Ascension of Isaiah survived in its complete form in one place on earth, Ethiopia, not coincidence, not accident. The preservation of the complete text is the preservation of the complete map. And wait until you hear what the final piece of evidence reveals, because it changes the entire picture. The twist is not that this knowledge was hidden. The twist is what this knowledge actually was, and why the moment you understand it, you realize it has been staring at the modern world from an entirely unexpected direction for the last 40 years. Here is where everything changes. For the entire length of this investigation, we have been operating under an assumption so deeply embedded in how we talk about secret teachings that almost nobody stops to question it. The assumption is this, that what Jesus transmitted to his inner circle was information, hidden facts, esoteric propositions, a secret doctrine that, if you knew, it would change what you believed. That assumption is wrong. And the Ethiopian tradition, if you read it carefully, structurally, rather than just cataloging its unusual books, makes this unmistakably clear. What Jesus transmitted was not a secret doctrine, it was a secret practice. The difference is not semantic, it is everything. A doctrine can be written down, voted on, standardized, and controlled through institutional authority. You can require people to profess it. You can test whether they believe it correctly. You can build a hierarchy whose primary function is mediating access to it. A practice cannot be institutionalized in the same way. A practice lives in the body, in the breath, in the quality of attention a person brings to a moment of interior stillness. It can be transmitted from teacher to prepared student. It can be pointed to by texts. It can be structured by a tradition, but it cannot be owned, it cannot be taxed, it cannot be made to require a priest as intermediary. This is not a fringe interpretation. This is what the evidence read carefully across multiple independent sources actually points toward. The witness of the Apocryphon of James revisited. Go back to the Apocryphon of James, which we examined in Part 6. When Jesus tells James and Peter that they must become full before they can transmit what they have received, what does fullness mean in that context? The text gives us the answer 2 pages later. Jesus describes it as a state of interior silence in which the noise of ordinary thought ceases and something else becomes audible. He tells them, pay attention to the word, understand knowledge, love life, and no one will persecute you, nor will anyone oppress you other than you yourselves. This is not a call to correct belief. This is a description of an interior condition, a state of awareness that precedes and enables everything else. The persecution Jesus warns against is not external. It is the internal persecution of an untrained mind, the ceaseless noise of thought that prevents the deeper signal from being received. The language maps precisely onto what contemplative traditions across multiple cultures independently describe as the foundational practice of interior prayer. The deliberate cultivation of a quality of attentive stillness in which the practitioner moves from thinking about the divine to direct experiential contact with it. The Ascension of Isaiah as a practice manual. The Ascension of Isaiah, preserved complete only in Ethiopia, has traditionally been read as apocalyptic literature, a visionary journey through 7 heavens, spectacular imagery, cosmic drama, but read it again through the lens we have just established. The prophet does not simply travel through 7 levels of heaven. He is prepared at each threshold. Each level requires a different quality of interior readiness. At each gate, something is asked of him, not a password, not a correct doctrinal statement, but a deepening of interior disposition. The journey is inward. The 7 heavens are not locations in space. They are conditions of consciousness, each one requiring greater stillness, greater surrender of ordinary mental activity before passage is granted. Dr. Martha Himmelfarb of Princeton University, whose research on Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature has been foundational in the field, has argued that the ascent texts of this period, of which the Ascension of Isaiah is among the most complete, functioned in early communities not merely as visionary entertainment, but as templates. Maps for an interior journey that practitioners were expected to undertake in their own experience, guided by teachers who had made the journey themselves. Ethiopia preserved this text in full. The Western Church set it aside, and the implications of that choice become visible only when you understand what the text was actually for. The Witness of Morton Smith. In 1958, a young scholar from Columbia University named Morton Smith was cataloging manuscripts at the monastery of Marsaba in the Judean desert when he discovered something extraordinary. In the back pages of a 17th century printed book, someone had copied by hand what appeared to be a letter from Clement of Alexandria, one of the earliest and most sophisticated Christian theologians, writing around 200 CE. In the letter, Clement refers to a longer version of the Gospel of Mark, not the Mark in your Bible. A second version, which Clement describes as reserved for those who were being perfected, initiates who had undergone a process of spiritual preparation. Clement calls it a more spiritual gospel for the use of those who are being perfected. He also warns the letter's recipient not to share its contents with everyone, not out of conspiracy, but because, as Clement explains, not everyone is in the same condition of readiness, and to give advanced transmission to an unprepared mind is not generosity, it is harm. Smith published his findings in 1973 in a book titled Clement of Alexandria and A Secret Gospel of Mark. The academic response was fierce. Some scholars questioned the discovery's authenticity, others accepted it. The debate continues, but the letter's central claim that Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 CE, knew of a two-tiered version of the Gospel of Mark 1, public and one reserved for prepared initiates, is consistent with everything else the evidence shows about how early Christianity actually functioned before standardization. Clement was Alexandrian. His tradition flowed into Ethiopia. And in the Ethiopian Andemta system, with its 4 levels of scriptural meaning, its outermost layer accessible to all, and its innermost layer reserved for those who had done the preparatory work, you can see exactly the structural logic that Clement was describing still functioning 15 centuries later. The neuroscience laboratory and the 40-day parallel now. The final piece, the one I promised you at the end of Part 6. In 1975, a cardiologist at Harvard Medical School named Herbert Benson published a book called The Relaxation Response. Benson had spent years studying the physiological effects of a specific type of interior practice, the deliberate, sustained cultivation of a quiet, focused mental state, achieved through a simple, repetitive technique. What he found changed the direction of Western medicine. The practice produced measurable, reproducible physiological changes, decreased heart rate, reduced cortisol levels, altered brainwave patterns, lowered blood pressure, and most significantly, changes in the prefrontal cortex consistent with what neurologists call a shift from default mode network activity to present moment awareness. In plain language, the brain in this state is operating differently from the brain engaged in ordinary discursive thought. Not worse, differently, in a way that appears across dozens of subsequent studies to be associated with reduced anxiety, increased emotional regulation, and what subjects consistently describe as a quality of interior clarity they had not previously experienced. Benson derived his method from transcendental meditation, a practice rooted in the Vedic tradition of India. He deliberately stripped the religious framing to make it scientifically credible in a Western medical context. His student, John Kabat-Zinn, at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, later developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, drawing from Buddhist contemplative practice and applying it in clinical settings. Today, the mindfulness industry generates an estimated $4 billion annually in the United States alone. Here is what nobody in that industry is saying out loud, the structural core of what Benson documented. The deliberate shift from discursive mental activity to sustained present moment attentive stillness, practiced repeatedly over time. Producing measurable interior transformation is not a Buddhist invention. It is not a Vedic invention. It is a human capacity that has been independently discovered and systematically cultivated by contemplative traditions across multiple cultures for thousands of years. Including the Ethiopian evidence strongly suggests by Jesus himself, and by the community of practice he was building during 40 days of unrecorded transmission. The Andemta fourth level, the mystical layer of scriptural meaning reserved for advanced students, is not a description of theological propositions. It is a pointer toward a direct interior experience, an experience that requires preparation, that cannot be rushed, that must be transmitted from someone who has made the journey to someone who is ready to begin it. Herbert Benson did not know he was rediscovering something 2,000 years old. John Kabat-Zinn did not know he was mapping the same territory that the ascension of Isaiah described in the 2nd century BCE. The neuroscientists at Massachusetts General Hospital, who published the 2011 landmark study on structural brain changes after 8 weeks of mindfulness practice, led by Dr. Sarah Lazar, did not know they were providing the first neurological evidence for exactly the kind of interior transformation that the Apocryphon of James describes Jesus urging his disciples to undergo. They arrived at it from physiology. Jesus arrived at it from the other direction, and Ethiopia alone among the world's Christian traditions kept the map that connects the two. Not because Ethiopia was lucky, not because Ethiopian monks were more devout than their counterparts elsewhere, but because Ethiopia received its Christianity before Eusebius decided what Christianity was allowed to contain. And what it contained, the Andemta system, the ascension of Isaiah, the 4-level architecture of sacred transmission, was precisely what Eusebius's project required to disappear. It didn't disappear. It waited. Let me bring this closer to home, because everything we have covered so far, the 40 days, the 2-tiered teaching system, the Andemta tradition, the ascension of Isaiah, the neuroscience laboratory at Harvard, it all converges on a single question that is not historical. It is not theological. It is immediate and personal, and it applies to your life right now, today, in the moment you are sitting with this information. The question is this: what happens to a person who actually does the practice, not the doctrine, not the belief system, not the institutional affiliation, the practice, the interior discipline that Jesus was transmitting to his closest disciples during those 40 unrecorded days? The thing that Ethiopia preserved structurally, while the West preserved only the surface layer of the story. What actually happens? And the answer coming simultaneously from a 2,000-year-old Ethiopian transmission tradition and from the most rigorous neuroscience laboratories in the world is more specific than you might expect. What the Ethiopian tradition says happens. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church school system, a student who reaches the fourth level of Andemta, the mystical layer, the one reserved for those who have done sufficient preparatory work, is not handed a new set of propositions to believe. They are guided toward a specific quality of interior experience that the tradition describes with remarkable consistency across centuries of teaching. The experience is described in Ge'ez, using a term that translates approximately as the stillness in which the heart listens. It is not an absence of thought in the sense of mental blankness. It is a condition of alert, receptive quiet, what the Christian Hesychast tradition of the Eastern Orthodox Church independently calls hesychia, from the Greek word for stillness or tranquility. A condition in which the ordinary noise of self-referential mental activity quiets sufficiently for something else to become perceptible. Teachers in the Ethiopian tradition describe this condition not as a destination, but as a beginning. The starting point for a different quality of understanding, one that cannot be achieved through study alone, no matter how extensive, because it requires a fundamental shift in the instrument of knowing. Not the analytical mind acquiring more information, the whole person becoming more receptive. This is what the fourth level of Andemta points toward. This is what the ascension of Isaiah maps. This is what the Apocryphon of James describes Jesus urging James and Peter to undergo before they attempt to transmit anything to anyone else. And here is what should stop you completely. This is also with near-perfect structural correspondence, what Herbert Benson documented in the basement of Beth Israel Hospital in Boston in the early 1970s. What the neuroscience says happens. The 2011 study, led by Dr. Sarah Lazar at Massachusetts General Hospital, was not the first study on contemplative practice and brain function, but it was among the most rigorous, and its findings were among the most striking. Lazar and her team used magnetic resonance imaging to measure the cortical thickness of participants before and after an 8-week program of structured contemplative practice. Specifically, John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction protocol. The results published in the journal Psychiatry Research Neuroimaging showed measurable increases in gray matter density in 4 specific brain regions after just 8 weeks of practice. The regions that changed were not random. They included the left hippocampus, associated with learning, memory, and emotional regulation; the posterior cingulate cortex, associated with mind-wandering and self-referential thought; the temporoparietal junction, associated with perspective-taking and compassion; and the cerebellum, associated with the regulation of emotion and behavioral responses. The region that showed measurable decrease in gray matter density was equally significant: the amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection center, the region most directly associated with chronic stress anxiety and fear-based reactivity. In plain language, 8 weeks of structured interior practice produced measurable physical changes in the brain. The parts of the brain associated with reactive fear decreased. The parts associated with learning compassion and present-moment awareness increased. This is not philosophy. This is not spirituality in the dismissive sense that word sometimes carries. This is structural neurological change, documented by MRI, peer-reviewed and replicated across multiple subsequent studies at institutions including Yale, Oxford, and the Max Planck Institute. And the practice that produced these changes at its structural core, stripped of its Buddhist framing, is the same practice that the Ethiopian Andemta tradition points toward at its 4th level. The same practice the ascension of Isaiah maps as a journey through successive thresholds of interior preparation. The same practice that Jesus, in the Apocryphon of James, appears to be urging his closest disciples to undertake and embody before they attempt to guide anyone else. The convergence is not coincidental. It is pointing at something real about human consciousness, something that multiple traditions discovered independently because they were all investigating the same territory. What was lost? When the practice was replaced by doctrine. Here is the cost, and it is worth naming directly. When Eusebius of Caesarea constructed his authorized narrative of Christian origins in the early 4th century, when the communities that preserved interior practice traditions were reframed as heretics, when their texts were set aside, when the 4-level architecture of sacred transmission was flattened into a single layer of propositional belief mediated by institutional clergy. What was lost was not merely a set of interesting ideas. What was lost was a technology, a repeatable, teachable, transmittable technology for interior transformation, one that produced measurable changes in the practitioner, one that Jesus appears to have considered important enough to spend 40 days transmitting to his closest disciples after the resurrection, the most intensive period of private instruction recorded anywhere in the Christian tradition. The replacement was not equivalent. Propositional belief assenting to correct doctrinal statements does not produce the same neurological changes as sustained contemplative practice. Attending services, performing sacraments, and professing creeds are not without value, but they are not the same thing as what the Ethiopian tradition calls the 4th level of Andemta. They are not the same thing as what the Apocryphon of James describes. They are not the same thing as what Sarah Lazar measured in her MRI machine in Boston in 2011. 17 centuries of Western Christianity developed largely without this technology at its center. The mystical traditions that preserved fragments of it, the Desert Fathers, the Hesychasts, the Rhineland mystics, the Carmelites, were consistently marginalized within their own institution. John of the Cross was imprisoned by his own order. Meister Eckhart's teachings were condemned after his death. The Hesychast controversy of the 14th century nearly tore the Eastern Orthodox Church apart. In each case, the threat was the same, not to God, not to faith, but to institutional authority, because a practice that connects the practitioner directly to interior experience of the divine does not require an intermediary, and an institution built on intermediation has a structural interest in preventing that connection from being made too cleanly, too directly, too independently. What this means for you right now. The mindfulness industry. $4 billion annually. Corporate wellness programs, therapy, modalities, smartphone applications is selling you a secularized, neurologically validated version of a practice that Jesus appears to have considered the most important thing he could transmit to the people he trusted most. It arrived in the West through Buddhism, through the Vedic tradition, through Jon Kabat-Zinn's careful clinical framing, but the capacity it cultivates, the shift from reactive, self-referential mental noise to receptive, present moment interior stillness, is not owned by any tradition. It is a feature of human consciousness that every genuine contemplative tradition discovered independently, because it is actually there, waiting to be found in every human nervous system. Ethiopia kept the Christian map to this territory. Not the only map, but a map that is specifically continuous with the tradition of Jesus preserved before Rome decided what that tradition was allowed to contain, which means something rather extraordinary. If you have ever sat quietly, genuinely, quietly, not scrolling, not planning, not rehearsing conversations, and noticed a quality of interior stillness that felt different from your ordinary mental state, You have touched the edge of what the Andemta fourth level points toward, what the ascension of Isaiah maps, what the Apocryphon of James describes Jesus urging his disciples to cultivate until it became their permanent condition. You did not need a priest to get there. You did not need an institution. You needed the practice. That is precisely what made it dangerous to the institution. And that is precisely why Ethiopia, which developed outside the institutional pressure that made it dangerous, is the one tradition that kept the structural memory of what it actually was. The final question is not historical. It is not about Ethiopia or Eusebius or the Council of Nicaea. The final question is what you do with this now. What it means to know that a practice this old, this documented, this neurologically real, has been quietly preserved on the other side of the world, while the tradition that claimed ownership of Jesus spent 17 centuries building something else in his name. That question deserves a direct answer. Let me take you to a hillside in northern Israel. The year is 2009. A construction crew working on a tourist promenade near the ancient town of Magdala on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee strikes something solid beneath the earth. Excavation begins. What emerges over the following months is the first century synagogue discovered on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, a synagogue that would have been standing fully operational during the years of Jesus' public ministry. Inside the synagogue, archaeologists from the Israel Antiquities Authority uncover what they name the Magdala Stone, a carved block bearing the earliest known three-dimensional representation of the Jerusalem temple menorah, etched by someone who had almost certainly seen the temple in person. The stone dates to the 1st century CE. It is not decorative. Based on its position in the room, archaeologists conclude it functioned as a reading platform, a place where sacred texts were read aloud and interpreted for the assembled community. Interpreted in layers. For an assembled community gathered specifically to receive those layers. Dr. Dina Avshalom Gorny, the lead archaeologist on the Magdala excavation, noted in her published report that the community using this synagogue was not a mainstream Pharisaic assembly. The architectural features and associated artifacts suggest a community with strong connections to Jewish mystical practice, specifically the tradition of Merkabah mysticism, which sought direct interior experience of the divine through structured contemplative ascent, Merkabah, the chariot. The same tradition that produced the ascent texts, the same literature that the ascension of Isaiah belongs to, the same interior geography that the Ethiopian tradition mapped through the Andemta system, the same experiential territory that Sarah Lazar's MRI machine documented in Boston in 2011. Jesus taught in synagogues exactly like this one, possibly in this one. He taught in communities where the idea of layered sacred knowledge, public meaning for the assembled congregation interior, meaning for those prepared to go deeper, was not radical. It was the architecture of the tradition he had grown up inside. This is the final piece, and it changes everything that came before it, because it means the two-tiered teaching system Jesus used was not an innovation. It was not a secret conspiracy. It was not something he invented to keep the crowds at a distance. It was the normal operating structure of the Jewish mystical tradition he had been formed by, expressed now through his own specific transmission, refined, embodied, and during 40 post-resurrection days transmitted with an urgency and completeness he had not been able to offer during his public ministry. The 40 days were not a farewell. They were a completion. The public ministry had planted seeds broadly in soil of every quality exactly as the parable of the sower described. The 40 days were the intensive cultivation of the ground that was ready, the disciples who had remained, who had witnessed, who had done enough interior work to receive what came next. And what came next was the practice, the map, the technology, preserved through Frumentius, through the 9 saints, who arrived in Ethiopia in the 5th century, carrying Syrian and Alexandrian traditions through generations of Andemta teachers in church schools, carved into the Ethiopian highlands in the one Christian tradition that Eusebius never reached. Now come back to where we started. 40 days, 11 disciples, 0 pages in your Bible. We began with that silence and asked what it meant. We have our answer now, and it is not what most people in this space are saying. The silence is not evidence of conspiracy. It is not evidence that Rome burned the records. It is evidence of something more interesting and more challenging than either of those things. The silence exists because what Jesus transmitted during those 40 days was not primarily a text. It was a practice. And a practice, by its nature, does not survive in the same way a document does. It survives in bodies, in transmission, in the living relationship between a teacher who has made the interior journey and a student who is being prepared to make it themselves. Documents can be burned, canons can be voted on, councils can decide which books are in and which are out. But a practice that lives in the relationship between teacher and student passed down in the Andemta tradition. From the 5th century to the present day, encoded in the structural logic of the ascension of Isaiah, pointed toward. By the Apocryphon of James, confirmed in its neurological reality by the MRI studies of the 21st century, cannot be fully suppressed. It can be marginalized. It can be reframed as heresy. It can be made to seem foreign, dangerous, or unnecessary. But it cannot be made untrue. And here is what that means for you specifically. You are not watching this investigation as a passive consumer of interesting historical information. You are watching it because something in you recognized before you could articulate it, that the version of faith you inherited or rejected was incomplete. That the surface layer of the story, however beautiful, was missing something that should have been central. That the practice, the interior technology, the direct experiential encounter with the divine that Jesus appears to have considered the most important thing he could transmit, had been quietly replaced by something more manageable and less transformative. You were right. The evidence says you were right. And the fact that Ethiopia preserved the structural memory of what was replaced, not perfectly, not without its own historical complications and limitations, but continuously from the 4th century to the present day, means that the map still exists. It has always existed. It was never destroyed. It was waiting in the highlands, in the monasteries, in the 4-level architecture of a teaching tradition that refused to flatten the mystery into a single manageable layer. 40 days, 11 disciples, 0 pages in your Bible. Now you know what those pages would have contained. Not secrets in the conspiratorial sense, not hidden knowledge designed to exclude, but a map carefully preserved for those who had done the interior work to read it, offered now in this moment to anyone who is ready. The question the hook asked at the beginning of this investigation was about silence. About 40 days of teaching that left almost no written record in the tradition that claimed ownership of them. The question we are ending with is different, and it is bigger. Now that you have the map, what are you going to do with it? If this investigation did something to you, if it shifted something even slightly in how you understand the tradition you were handed, or the one you walked away from, I want you to sit with that for a moment before you do anything else. Because that shift is the point, not the information, the shift. That is what the 4th level of Andemta points toward. That is what the Apocryphon of James describes. That is what 40 days of unrecorded teaching were apparently designed to produce. Not a new set of facts to carry around, a different quality of seeing. If you felt that today, even at the edges, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for, subscribe and activate the notification bell. Not because the algorithm needs it, though it does, but because this investigation is one thread in a much longer inquiry. Every week we follow another trail through the documented historical record, the suppressed manuscripts, the archaeological discoveries that rewrote the consensus without ever making the evening news. Each investigation builds on the last. The picture that emerges over time is larger and more coherent than any single video can contain. The next investigation is already waiting for you. We are going deeper into the Ethiopian transmission tradition, specifically into the practice of tsoma, the structured fasting discipline preserved in Ethiopian Christianity, that the Didache describes that the early Desert Fathers practiced, and that modern neuroscience has now identified as one of the most reliable triggers for the same neurological state that sustained contemplative practice produces. It is older than monasticism. It is older than the church. And almost nobody in the Western world knows it exists in the form Ethiopia preserved it. Click the video on your screen now. The trail continues directly from where we ended tonight. And one more thing. In the first pinned comment below this video, I have left a reference guide, the 12 primary sources we drew on in this investigation, with notes on where to access each one. No pitch, no paywall, just the reading list. Because if this investigation sparked genuine curiosity, you should be able to follow it yourself in the original sources and reach your own conclusions. That is what this channel is built on. Not authority. Evidence. Before you go, I want to ask you something in the comments. The Ethiopian Andemta tradition teaches that sacred knowledge moves in 4 levels, with the deepest layer reserved for those who have done the interior work to receive it. Do you think that model is elitist, or is it simply honest about how transformation actually works? Tell me where you land. I read every response. See you in the next investigation. This content is produced for educational and historical reflection purposes, drawing on documented texts, scholarly research, and spiritual tradition. It represents one perspective in an ongoing conversation about faith and history, not a definitive claim. If this investigation spoke to you, subscribe to continue the journey.